Hello everyone. Today's video is about the validity of mold mycotoxin testing. Just before jumping into the video, if you don't mind taking a quick moment to please either like, share, subscribe, and or post a quick comment on the video, I'd really appreciate it. So thanks in advance for taking a second to do that. And as per usual, nothing I'm saying should be construed as medical advice. This is for informational purposes only. If you need medical advice, please talk to your healthcare provider to get that advice. So I posted a video about 10 days ago. It's called Best Tests for Mold Toxicity and Intestinal Bacterial Levels. And then someone posted a comment/question on the video that goes like this. It says, thank you for the video. That's interesting. You recommend using no glutathione. That's the opposite to what other practitioners like Jill Krista and Neil Nathan say. I thought Great Plains were measuring urine metabolites only. Has that changed? I've been doubting mycotoxin testing lately because everyone would excrete mycotoxins, but not everyone gets affected by them. Then there is, as you mentioned, food contamination and colonization possibility. So is this a good test given its variables and high price? Of course, no test is ideal. What do you think of the mycotoxin IgE test? So thank you for the question, comments, and really good question. I think as clinicians we have to be really discerning around how accurate are these tests, what are they picking them up, what are the different variables that come into play. Just for reference, I had in this video mentioned that with my patients, when I recommend that they do a mycotoxin test, I recommend that they generally do not take glutathione leading up to the test, because the lab that I use, which is Mosaic Diagnostics, formerly known as Great Plains Laboratories, my understanding is that using glutathione can potentially interfere with the results of the test, because it will enhance the metabolism and then basically with some of the tests. So my understanding, and I could be wrong about this, I am fallible as a human, but my understanding of it is that we don't want to use glutathione, or we want to, there's no hard and fast rules around this, but clinicians may not want to recommend glutathione when during the prep process leading up to doing a Great Plains test, because of the way that what they're testing, as opposed to, say, real-time labs or US Biotech, which uses the same uses real time to process their samples. To my understanding, with them it doesn't matter if you use glutathione, because they're able to pick up the metabolites, where with Great Plains they're not picking up the metabolites. So that was my understanding of it. But if someone knows the reality to be the contrary, please let me know. Be very curious to know about that, but that's my understanding of it. And so, and then I have heard, and I know it's one of those things where we have these, experts, these, wonderful, learned clinicians, like Jill Krista, like Neil Nathan, these brilliant minds who, go out there and speak at conferences and put together training courses and all these wonderful things. And so, we listen to them, learn from them, and, I never want to be considered to be speaking for them. Anytime I talk about, what I've heard from this doc or another doc, I always try to be careful to say, this is my understanding for what they said, but not go right to the horse's mouth to see exactly what they said. So I believe, if memory serves, that I've heard one of them say that they're selective with when they're using glutathione in the prep process and when they're not. So I don't know that there's a hard and fast rule that one of them has said, like, oh yes, you have to use glutathione or whatnot. But then anyways, again, this is my understanding of it. What I can say is that when I started asking patients to not use glutathione, because I used to recommend that they take glutathione beforehand, because that's what everyone recommended at one point, and then that recommendation changed. Conferences started talking about these things a little bit differently, and some of the experts are like, no, some of them say, no, don't use glutathione, at least with certain types of testing. Do say like a sweating provocation to get more accurate results, or more sort of representative results of what's going on. I found that making those changes, so cutting out the glutathione and bringing in the sweating provocation, seemed to lead to notably higher levels coming up in patients by and large. So I'd be seeing, once upon a time, maybe the highest ochratoxin I would see would be like in the 20s, and then sometimes that's all that I would see, but like now I'll see in the 50s or 60s or 100 or beyond, seeing just notably higher levels on average. And so it suggests to me that this provocation is actually, getting things moving and maybe giving us a better representation of what's going on, I've always asked my patients to follow a prep diet that's low in mycotoxins because I want to minimize the chances of there being any, false positives coming up. And, that's always been a constant. So I think the fact that I'm seeing higher, I've been doing the provocation and asking patients not consume glutathione for a few days leading up to that for a long time now. But when I did make that change several years ago, they were still doing the same prep diet. So the fact that I'm seeing higher levels of mycotoxins coming out, I do believe, the best I can tell, that must be representative of tissue levels being higher. The person asking the questions here does make a really good point that not everyone's affected by mycotoxins. I mean, be interesting to actually talk to this person and, because nuances, when we're typing things out on YouTube comments, probably some nuances that are missing here. This individual has asked a number of other questions. I happen to know that they're a learned individual as well. They think these things through. They have a significant knowledge base that they're coming from with this. So I know that none of these questions are kind of just off the cuff or willy-nilly. But I mean, let's see here. It says here, there was just something in here. Maybe it's just a nuance thing. But what was it? Let's see here. Right, yeah, because it says everyone would excrete mycotoxins, but not everyone gets affected by them. So, and again, might be semantics, but if that's insinuating that, like, oh, everybody has mycotoxins, everything comes up, everybody tests positive for mycotoxins on these tests. If that's what that comment is intended to mean, and maybe it's not, but if it was, I definitely get negatives across the board for mycotoxins on a semi-regular basis. I mean, when we run mycotoxin testing, we're running it in patients where generally, with rare exception, where we're thinking that there was a mold exposure. Sometimes we're not sure, but where that's like been a likely scenario. As was also mentioned, these tests are too expensive to just run willy-nilly. And so granted, it's a biased population that we're testing on, but we see just negatives across the board, semi-regularly. So, I've seen that, a number of times in practice. Just in the last few weeks, one of my residents, she's had 2 patients that she was talking about during our meetings where, negatives across the board. So it's not that, oh, there's mycotoxins in everyone, but it is very true that, you could run a test, because sometimes we'll run a test on, say, like the significant other of the patient. They're like, I want to know if my husband or my wife or whoever, like, or my kids, like, had, mycotoxin exposure too. It's like, well, are they sick? No, they feel great. It's like, well, do we really need to run this test? Because, yeah, maybe they have exposure, but it's not making them sick. But, sometimes we'll run the test, and sure enough, in patients who are individuals who are asymptomatic, we see, mycotoxins coming up. So it's very true that mycotoxins, just because they're present, doesn't mean that they're causing symptoms. But I do feel like the test has value, which is why I do recommend it for my patients, because I think that what I've seen in my practice is that if we do see elevated levels, especially particularly highly elevated levels of mycotoxins, it does seem to predict who's going to respond to the mold treatment protocol versus folks who have very low levels or maybe nothing comes up on their test results. I also think that it is a useful tool to track progress over time, although there are nuances around that. We have to be really careful with interpreting follow-up results because there are certain standard deviations and things like that in terms of, like, what's actually going to be a statistically significant difference. But then also bearing in mind, is, what's the prep like? If a patient says, like, oh yeah, I did the prep and they actually were chowing down on a bunch of like, mold mycotoxin prone foods, then like that could lead to some, potential false positives or results that are kind of sending us off on a little bit of a wild goose chase. So I really take to heart what was mentioned in this question. I think that, really holding a test's feet to the fire, so to speak, is a good idea, a really important thing for us to do as clinicians. I'm not saying that mycotoxin testing is perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but I do feel like it's clinically useful, taking all these things into account. The very last part of the question here is, what do I think about mycotoxin IgE testing? So IgE antibodies are basically allergy antibodies, and there's at least one lab, if not a couple of labs, that offer this type of testing. I never prescribed it for my patients, and I haven't because I'm just not sure how useful it would be. If a patient is, clearly having allergic type symptoms to the presence of mold, then great. I don't really need a test to show that per se. Granted, sometimes allergy symptoms are just being overshadowed by so many other things that are going on. So it might be, useful in some circumstances to run a test like that, but it's not something that I have any direct clinical experience with and haven't really gone down that rabbit hole because I'm just not sure how clinically useful it is. So thank you for the questions and thoughts on this. I hope this information was of interest to folks. If anybody has any questions or comments on this, please post in the comment section below. Otherwise, I will leave it there for now.